A new report by Vital City details the ways that our city is failing to produce new housing and talks about ways that we can improve things. The series includes articles on how the housing success story of Co-op City came about, the role that design plays in housing supply, and what we can learn from other cities like Jersey City and even Tokyo. One article examines how the next administration can ensure more housing gets produced while also addressing affordability. And it's the author of that article, Jamie Rubin, who's here now to talk through a lot of this. He helped edit all of the other articles, and he, of course, is the chair of the New York City Housing Authority Board, as well as the chief investment officer of Aligned Climate Capital, an investment firm of clean energy companies. Thank you so much for being here. Good to see you.
Thanks, Errol. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. I'm tempted to dive into some NYC stuff, but we've got so much more to talk about. I want to show folks, put up the graphic of housing production in New York City, because I think this kind of lays the table for where things are.
Yep.
In the 1920s, 100 years ago, 730,000 new homes were added, which is nearly 4 times what we've done in the last decade or so. And as recently as the 1960s, we were doing twice as many as we're doing now. Now, in your article, you point out that when the candidates are sort of pledging this number of units and that number of units, they're kind of missing the point.
I think they're missing the point in the sense, they're not missing the point obviously in the overall number. We need a lot more housing than we have now. Some would say 500 to 1 million new units in the next, let's say, 10 years. So in that sense, they're right. Where I think they miss things, and where past mayors and past housing officials in those past mayoral administrations have missed things, is by focusing people on those units as if those are the sole way they should be measured, and working within a system that can't possibly succeed under those terms, because everything takes too long.
Right.
When you come in as mayor your first day, if you say you're going to create 10,000 new units of housing, it may take you 10 years to do that. So telling people that you've done it at the end of the first year it simply can't be accurate.
Right. Well, a lot of the politicians I've noticed, they say that we have plans to, that we're going to create or maintain or plan 1 million units, right? I mean, okay, fine, we're planning to do a lot of stuff.
When I worked for Governor Cuomo as housing commissioner, we had a plan that would create 200,000 units over 10 years. And I knew when I did it that it really wasn't perhaps as clear as it ought to be.
There was a great discussion of why it's so expensive to build in New York. One thing that stood out for me, project approvals take 30 days in Houston, 15 months in San Francisco, in New York City, 2.5 years.
Yep.
I mean, that alone will slow everything down.
Time is money.
Yeah.
That's all you can say. Time is money.
And why is it? I mean, there's a lot of little things, but from your point of view, what's the big thing we could do to get things moving?
Well, I'll tell you a couple things. What I said in my article, and my article was not intended to be a specific agenda for one candidate or another candidate, because in many cases the details are going to be up to the candidate, whoever it is that becomes the mayor. The point that I was trying to make was step back, and we need to understand how the next mayor is going to make decisions on housing writ large. A mayor is a decision maker. Mayor Bloomberg was a great decision maker. Others have been perhaps less good decision makers. They make a few decisions every day, and everything else is execution. I want to know how that mayor is going to think about the housing policy that he or she, here in this case, executes. So that was intended that was sort of the point of that article. In terms of the details of why we have such a problem, that we ended up covering more than anything else in this issue. We ended up getting articles from people unsolicited in some cases about the Charter Review Commission's housing questions that they're putting forward also on the November ballot. I know you've talked to other people about that. It sort of took over the process in some ways and it sort of blotted out the sun, because it's just so obviously needed as the best way we have in front of us right now to speed up the process that you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, we have in effect veto power that individual city council members have over different projects, and they can kill very big, very important projects, or they can slow them down to the point where the cost just kind of becomes too great to bear and developers just walk away.
It's worse than that in many ways, Errol. The killing of projects, or really the scaling down of projects, is a major problem, obviously, because that by itself wraps you up in it costs money in cases that nobody can afford them, and it costs us housing units even if they get developed. The worst problem is the one we never see, and that's the number of projects that die before they get anywhere near that process. We don't know. You can't prove a negative. We have no idea which projects they are, but they're often going to be projects put forward or developed by people, smaller developers, women, people of color, who don't have the resources to stick it out for that 2.5-year period, they get scared off by this process and they'll go do something else or nothing at all.
It sounds like we have in some ways, a decision-making and democracy problem, not just a housing problem.
Like so much else in the city and in the country, we have a serious democracy problem. But this one, unlike many others, I think is fixable.
Yeah. Well, because how do we do that? I mean, you lay out some principles that seem to make a lot of sense. Although you and I both know that you go to any given individual neighborhood, and there will be, 100, 200, 300 people who are going to say no to whatever is coming down the road.
Yep.
And if they're diligent and they're creative, and many of them are,
very
some of them
creative.
Are my friends,
yeah.
They can grind the process to a halt.
They can. The mayor is going to have to stand up, no matter what happens with the Charter Commission, with the questions. The mayor is going to have to stand up because this is going to be the single thing, along with public safety, I think, that's going to determine the success or failure of his administration. The mayor is going to have to stand up and declare that this is the problem he's going to solve. And he is not going to make everybody happy with his solutions. And that is, a lot of that is this neighborhood issue. And other things, other decisions he make will sort of fall out of that. And his whole government is going to be focused on that. I talked some about that in this article. But the solution that we have in front of us that luckily the voters can actually exercise their democratic right to vote and decide this November are the 6 and really the 4 housing questions on the ballot that our wonderful Charter Review Commission developed through a long process of taking public comment and using expert opinion and coming out with an excellent report.
And I guess one way to put it on these questions, or 3 of the 6 or whatever, 4 of the 6, is that it would not give the last word to the local council member. There would be situations in which they could be overridden or even bypassed on certain projects.
That's the ballot question. I think it's question number 4 that's gotten the most attention because it does seem, not really, but it does seem most directly to change the outcome of that particular kind of process, the ULURP process, when it does get all the way through the council. But in some ways, the more interesting and perhaps impactful questions concern that change the process before it gets to ULURP. ULURP is, as you've said, ULURP is this kind of bizarre Byzantine process nobody understands that basically means everything goes through the council and the council signs off. But there are now going to be different processes for different kinds of projects, including, very importantly, a separate process fast-tracking approvals, and before that gets to City Council, in the 12 council districts that have created the least housing on a per-person basis over the last number of years, and that they'll be decided after some analysis.
You suggest something that would be yet another big fight, demanding that landlords that have vacant rent-stabilized units fill those on a pretty aggressive timetable with serious consequences if they fail to do so.
Well, so let me be clear, and this is interesting because it does, if I can turn to politics for 1 second, I also said this in the article, probably the salient salient thing that any mayoral candidate said about housing was freeze the rent, which was Zoran Mamdani. Nothing else really came forward, despite a lot of words. What he was talking about in that proposal was, and this didn't get nobody focused on the details, but what he was really saying was all rent-stabilized units, so not all apartments, are going to have their rent frozen by the Rent Guidelines Board. Okay, what does that actually mean? It means that some number of units are not going to be able to raise their rent on a year-over-year basis, and that's going to impact some landlords, not all of them, with those apartments negatively. Not many of them are actually hold apartments that are mixed income, and most of the building is fine, and so it won't matter to them. The problem that we face with the rent-stabilized portfolio right now, it has nothing to do with Zoran Mamdani because he's not mayor, is that many of those apartments for the last several years have been underinvested severely, and they are, in some cases, uninhabitable or unrentable at certain rent levels. It's cheaper for the landlord not to rent them out. And the result of that is we have 50 to 100,000 vacant apartments in this city, which is criminal. I don't want to force landlords to rent anything. What I do want to do is have the city, and I think the next mayor's got to turn to this, but fast, look at that portfolio and figure out how to work those apartments out with the landlords, sometimes happily with them and sometimes, frankly, not happily with them.
Sure.
But get them back up above water and get them rented out.
Okay. I mean, one of the great articles in there, I recommend everybody take a look at this, went through dollar for dollar a couple of buildings, and the one in Washington Heights really caught my eye. They're losing $400,000+ a year on stabilized units, and there's kind of no way out of it.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting problem because, and it sort of tests how you feel about it sort of tests your outlook on the world in some cases, because Look, these are landlords who in many cases have owned these apartments for decades and made tons of money on them. It was a great investment to have a rent stabilized apartment in your life. The last few years have been tougher for a variety of reasons, including a change in the law, and it has been much harder on those landlords. Your level of sympathy for them a little bit depends on how you feel about the business of being a landlord, and some of them are absolutely struggling, and that's a problem. Some of them probably are struggling because of underinvesting along the way when they really should have been putting more money into those buildings.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, a lot of food for thought. Thanks so much for coming by. Great
Errol,
talking
thank
with
you.
you.